Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are exploring the incredibly long and complex history of one of the world's most ancient and influential civilizations, Egypt.
And we're tackling this by looking purely at a stack of sources you've given us. The mission, like always, is to pull out the really key bits of knowledge, the important insights, basically giving you a shortcut to getting informed on this massive topic.
Yeah, it's huge. And these sources, they cover pretty much everything, don't they? From the absolute beginnings, tied so closely to the Nile River, through thousands of years of, power dynamics, conquests, big cultural shifts, and right up into our own times.
It really is a journey through history, and our goal here is to help you grasp the major turning points and also those recurring themes, the enduring elements that keep cropping up in this material.
Okay, so where better to start than the beginning? The river that made it all happen.
Exactly, the Nile.
The sources really hammer this home, don't they? The Nile is presented as the absolute key to Egypt emerging as a civilization. It's what allowed agriculture way, way back in prehistoric times.
And it wasn't just about food, was it? This laid the groundwork for structured society and what one source calls its systematic exploration.
Right. And the name they used, Kemet, the Black Land, that comes directly from the Nile, too.
Yeah, the alluvium, that incredibly fertile black silt left behind after the floods. The sources really highlight this contrast. You got this thin ribbon of fertile land in the valley and delta.
Which is only like 5% of the country.
Something like that, yeah. Just 5% supporting settled life, and the rest is just vast desert.
So agriculture becomes this engine for change. The sources talk about rapid human and cultural evolution because of it, shifting from hunting and gathering to secure food sources.
And that security lets societies become more complex, right? You get these stratified societies emerging, different layers, different roles.
It's a foundation.
Totally. Agriculture provides the base for other big steps mentioned in the sources: metallurgy, complex irrigation, writing. It's the fertile ground, literally and figuratively, for civilization to grow.
And something else the sources bring up is Egypt's isolation for long periods.
Geographically.
Yeah, bordered by deserts, the sea, and that actually helped preserve all the amazing stuff we see today, the ruins, the monuments.
That isolation plus the super dry climate, you're right, it's crucial.
Yeah.
And our modern understanding, it really kicks off in the early 1800s.
The Rosetta Stone.
Exactly. Finding it and then, crucially, deciphering it. That's highlighted as the moment that bridged the gap, unlocking all this knowledge from monuments, tombs, papyri.
The sources make a pretty big claim here, too, that Egyptian civilization isn't just ancient history, it's a foundation for both the Western and semi-Arabic worlds.
Yeah, influencing things like biblical literature, Greek philosophy. It's a fundamental connection.
And they list specific contributions, too, right? Early advances in math, astronomy, medicine, complex religion.
Definitely. And the sources also mentioned we're currently in what they call second golden age of Western Egyptology, really digging into these early periods.
Okay, so the Nile sets the stage. What happens next as things start getting organized? The sources talk about the early dynastic period, maybe 3150 to 2613 BC.
Right. This is a time of state formation, centralization, but also, interestingly, heightened strife, as one source puts it. The focus seems to be on big projects, protecting harvests, building irrigation.
And this is when Upper and Lower Egypt, the South and North, get unified.
That's the traditional narrative, yeah, associated with King Narmer, First Dynasty. And they established Memphis, near the junction point, as the capital for this unified kingdom.
Which then leads into the Old Kingdom around 2700 to 2200 BC. And this is the big one, the Age of the Pyramid.
Synonymous with it, really.
Yeah.
This is when the pharaohs started building those absolutely colossal stone tombs.
The first big one mentioned is the Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, Third Dynasty.
Built by Imhotep, an incredible figure. The sources describe it as the largest, oldest stone structure of its kind. The first truly monumental stone building designed as a tomb complex.
And then, of course, Giza, the iconic ones. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, Fourth Dynasty.
And the sources stress their sheer scale, especially Khufu's Great Pyramid. It just speaks volumes about the power and resources the state had then.
Yeah.
And their preservation is amazing, thanks to that desert climate.
What about the writings inside, the pyramid texts?
Yeah, the sources describe those as highly magical, incredibly important, like too precious to be meaningless scrawls. They detail rituals like the opening of the mouth ceremony.
For reanimating the dead.
That seems to be the idea. And it's key, as the sources note, these weren't just tombs in isolation. They were part of huge complexes with temples attached.
They had plenty of materials too, basalt, other stones, Nile clay, sand, and even clever uses for papyrus, like for scaffolding.
Yeah, practical applications. There's also a curious note about one ruler's time. Smite's reign, being really well fed, suggests a peak of prosperity, maybe.
But the Old Kingdom didn't last forever.
No. It eventually ended, leaving the pyramids behind. The sources hint that ideas about succession, maybe meritocracy, hadn't quite taken root beyond divine lineage, and there was this growing worry about chaos.
Funerary practices apparently changed too. Certain texts weren't always included anymore.
Seems like it. A shift in practice.
And that fear of chaos, it seems pretty well founded looking at the next phase, the first intermediate period,
Yeah.
around 2180 to 2060 BC.
Right. Described as a time when the central government just broke down, collapsed. The sources say the exact causes are a bit obscure, maybe drought, maybe palace issues.
But the results were clear. Provincial governors, nomarchs. They took over locally.
Yeah, they gained autonomy, essentially became regional kings. Egypt fragmented into these independent local kingdoms all along the Nile.
And contemporary texts like the Admonitions of Ipuwer, they paint a really bleak picture, don't they?
Oh, incredibly vivid. Disorder, breakdown. The sources detail accounts of nomarchs looting tombs, robbing nobles, violence, destroying wells, cutting off water sources, just life becoming incredibly hard, custom weakening.
Wow. Princes killing fathers, lack of respect for gods, profanity, outsiders insulting the rich. It sounds awful.
It does. Even stories like the tale of the shipwrecked sailor apparently show traces of this disorder. But the sources also note, local power did re-emerge and solidify eventually out of this mess.
So after that breakdown, does Egypt pull itself back together?
It does. That leads us to the Middle Kingdom. Roughly 11th to 14th dynasties described as a definite rebound, a resurgence in the economy, in artistic activity.
And we have better sources for this period.
Yeah, historical records on statues, temples, tombs, plus the sources mention Middle Egyptian becoming a written language helps understanding.
The capital moves south to Thebes, right?
In the 11th dynasty, yes. And tomb architecture evolved again, moving from those rectangular mastabas to more elaborate forms. The sources even detail some funerary rites purification, preparing the body, filling the coffin, rituals for providing food in the afterlife.
And a more big building project?
Definitely. A resurgence in monumental temple building, colossal pharaoh statues. The sources mention specific architectural details becoming common, like certain types of gables and cornices, even two-level temples sometimes. The quality of Theban art from this time is particularly noted.
Okay, so Middle Kingdom is a high point again, but then another downturn, the second intermediate period.
Right. Described as a time of renewed disunity, North versus South again, and also worldwide neglect, whatever that entails exactly.
And the big thing here is foreign invasion.
Yes, critically. Seafaring people from Asia, the Hyksos, they invaded and actually conquered and ruled Lower Egypt, the Delta area, for about 100 years.
But Egypt fought back. From the south.
Yeah, resistance grew, led by princes from Thebes. Eventually, this conflict led to the Hyksos being expelled and a new, unified native dynasty rising.
The sources mention our records for this time are a bit patchy, though, mostly later summaries.
That's right. We rely a lot on later lists and summaries compiled by Egyptian priests. Information is somewhat limited.
But kicking out the Hyksos leads to the New Kingdom, 18th to 20th dynasties. And this is described as the absolute peak, right? Egypt's zenith of power.
Absolutely. This is the empire phase. Egypt projecting power deep into Nubia, south, and into Asia, north. It was internally complex, too. The sources mention Akhenaten's radical religious reforms, which ultimately failed, and then the restoration of the old ways.
And the evidence is just monumental. Great temples, huge statues, obelisks, incredible tombs.
Unprecedented wealth and power. Pharaohs like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Ramses II, they're mentioned for their building, collecting massive tribute, and using grand propaganda to glorify themselves.
But even this peak didn't last. The sources mention decline again.
Yeah, after Ramses II, things started to fray. A Hittite raid is mentioned, contributing to disunity, weakening central power by around 1075 BC. The sources suggest internal factors played a role too: envy, conflict over spoils among different groups.
Which takes us into the third intermediate period, ran 70 to 664 BC. More internal conflict, external defeats, Assyrians conquering Memphis.
Exactly. fragmented time, incomplete pharaoh list again, new dynasties popping up in the Delta.
There's that mention of the prophecy of Osiris Mot, commentary on being conquered.
Yes, touching on themes of divine manipulation, state unhappiness under foreign rule. The sources frame this as a really tough, unprecedented time for Egypt, emphasizing the strategic Delta and Egypt's struggle against invaders, plus internal rivalries, sometimes involving regional Sephardic rulers.
But then, a surprise revival, the late period, 664-332 BC.
Kinda, yeah. After Assyrian rule, there's a conscious effort to revive older Egyptian traditions. Ahmose unites the country, founded the Seto period, the 26th dynasty, really focused on bringing back Egyptian culture, religion, art.
But the threat of foreign domination didn't go away.
No. The Persians under Cambyses conquer Egypt, establishing the 27th dynasty under Darius I. The sources say daily life, farming, cities remained pretty stable, but losing political control was a major long-term issue.
Brief independence again, then more civil war.
Right, leading to the very last native dynasty before the Romans took over completely.
Which happened in 30 BC. The sources mark that as the end of over 3,000 years of Egyptian nationhood under native rule, a huge turning point.
Absolutely massive. End of an era.
What about the Greco-Roman period itself, Greeks arriving?
Initially looking for supplies, the sources say, then they discover mineral wealth and start settling. A distinction is made between early business settlers and later military ones who apparently saw natives as slaves.
But they brought influence too. Literature, science, philosophy.
Definitely. A whole new school of literature emerged, prominent Greek figures based in Egypt. There's that odd detail too about Greeks being mugged by cops but not facing trial, hints at complex dynamics on the ground.
Okay, fast forward again. Another huge shift. The Islamic conquest, 641 AD, led by Amr.
The sources give some detail here. The initial army size, including not just soldiers but citizens, maybe blacksmiths, builders, and Berber allies. They detail the campaign. Marches, Memphis being abandoned, the siege of Babylon fortress near modern Cairo, dealing with rain and mud.
And the aftermath, plunder, gold, silver.
Yeah. And admiration for the pyramids, Amr apparently even suggested moving them to the caliph, who said no. The sources say the local population was taken, but without specific restrictions on property or priests initially. A degree of pragmatism, maybe.
This starts the long Islamic period. Alexandria falls later, 652. Fustat, future Cairo, established in 642 with the first mosque.
Right. And Amr himself is noted for admiring antiquities and appointing a judge.
The population, then, the sources estimate over 4 million, with large Christian, Coptic, and Jewish minorities.
Yeah, significant diversity. And the administration relied on locals hiring Coptic officials for taxes. Coptic advisors like Al-Yahub were apparently crucial for teaching the rulers Coptic, because many records were still in Greek. Books also started coming in from places like Iraq.
But internal conflict continued within Islamic rule. Sunni governors versus the Shia Abbasid dynasty.
Yes, leading to the Abbasid conquest of Egypt in 749 AD. More shifts in power.
Which eventually leads to the Mamluk period and then the Ottomans in 1517. Why did the Ottomans take over?
The sources point to problems with Mamluk rule, corruption, inefficiency, high taxes, weak central control. That paved the way for the Ottoman invasion under Selim I.
Did the Ottomans change much?
They kept Arabic as the language, acknowledged the caliphate for religious legitimacy. But they also brought in their own officials, which caused friction. Often, governors gave ruling rights back to Mamluks locally, and certain powerful families got into government. It was complex.
And the sources mention something about slaves changing their role.
Yes, a really interesting point. Slaves started forming groups, attacking masters, leading to more Mamluk violence, disappearances, massacres, poisonings are mentioned. The whole power structure shifted. Locals became outsiders, Mamluks became a closed elite, lots of rivalry.
Okay, jumping way ahead now to modern Egypt, late 19th century British economic dominance.
Huge dominance. Massive investment in roads, railways, and especially the Suez Canal. One source says Britain had more capital in Egypt than India by the 1890s.
And this, plus debt, led to Britain basically taking political control in 1882.
Exactly. The sources explain how the economy got skewed towards cotton for British mills, and foreign investment was often speculative, benefiting foreigners most. Investment even dropped after Britain took formal control.
Which fueled nationalism, right? Anti-foreign feeling.
Absolutely. These inequities were potent fuel. Britain tightened its grip, declared a protectorate during WWI, ending even nominal independence, and controlled things via councils later.
And opposition groups emerged.
Two main ones highlighted. The Waft Party, broad nationalist, wanting independence, and the Muslim Brotherhood, with a religious and social welfare angle offering an alternative path.
Then there was the British-backed King Farouk from 1936.
All right. Sources mention government corruption, but also some economic recovery, like in wheat farming. The 1948 war really ramped up nationalism, though, highlighting Farouk's perceived weakness on inequality.
He tried some things, confiscating estates, building factories.
Mentioned, yeah. But discontent grew. A group of army officers, the Free Officers Movement, saw their chance. Led to the pretty bloodless coup in 1952. Farouk fled.
And a military regime took over. Revolutionary Command Council, General Naguib initially.
They moved fast. Took parliament, dissolved parties, nationalized banks, controlled the press, crushed opposition. Naguib talked about reconciliation, civilian rule.
But a 1956 constitution, while having a parliament and president, didn't really shift power.
The sources argue the parties were illusions. Real power stayed with the president, the military, state media, pervasive security services. That was the reality described.
It's interesting, though, how the sources discuss an earlier uprising. A section called the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 actually describes 1919.
Yes, it presents 1919 as the real People's Revolution, the first Egyptian revolution, against Ottoman and British oppression.
And it sounds like it was intense, violence after Zaghlul's exile.
Described as stupendous violence, boycotts, strikes, demonstrations, insurrection across the country. The sources detail masses rising in rage just days after the exile. Events in Port Said, leaderless rioting, destroying infrastructure. Egypt is for the Egyptians, everywhere. A powerful memory of popular action.
Okay, bringing us much closer to today. The Arab Spring, 2011. Protests against Mubarak.
He resigns, yes. But the sources note the protest movement fractured pretty quickly. Divisions between Islamists and secular leftist groups.
And the military stepped in.
Took control. But seemed reluctant to give it up, according to the sources. There was a transition period, elections, constitution, but the military effectively stayed in charge for at least a year.
More protests during that transition. Against the military's role.
Yes. Against perceived executive overreach, the army's continued influence. The sources argue it led to poor governance, failed reforms, and even the return of old regime figures, like Mubarak's last PM running for president.
Then Mohammed Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood gets elected in 2012.
Serves for just 1 year. The sources highlight his moves against the judiciary appointments, declarations, rushing a constitution which caused major friction. Egypt at that point is described as a cautionary tale of elective autocracy.
Until 2013, Morsi is overthrown.
After another popular uprising, yes, but then followed quickly by a military coup. The sources emphasize how surprising this was. A coup against a popularly elected president, even one facing protests, was unusual compared to typical modern coups against unelected regimes.
Looking back across all this history, what about the enduring cultural aspects? Ancient art and architecture.
So iconic. Temples, tombs, carvings, paintings, fresco technique. The sources stress clarity and function over pure aesthetics, using standardized forms, rich symbolism. Sculpture evolved, details like hair, poses changing over time.
And even after the Muslim conquest, some temple building continued for centuries.
Remarkably, yes. In parts of the Nile Valley up until the 12th century AD, according to the sources. A decline, yes, artists dispersed, stone buildings turned to mud, but not a complete stop everywhere immediately.
Religion was obviously huge.
Absolutely central. Worship of countless gods tied to everything, seen as legendary humans from the sun, believed to inhabit statues in temples, needing daily rituals, prayers. Constant struggle against chaos. Bloody sacrifices were common. Bulls, rams, geese, fish.
And the belief that priests, even gods, needed help after death, driving monument building.
Exactly. Priests becoming gods, dead gods needing honoring through sacrifice that fueled the massive construction of temples, tombs, pyramids, all into supporting the divine order, especially in the afterlife.
Key gods mentioned are Osiris, Horus, Isis.
Right. Osiris, the slain and resurrected king. Horus, the falcon god linked to kingship, sky, geography. Isis, the powerful mother goddess. Groups like the Children of the Sun. Pharaoh, sometimes seen as a fierce goddess. Hathor as a cow goddess, embracing Osiris, resisting chaos, giving birth to him. Ritual dramas played out their stories. Isis became almost universal.
What about the economy and trade? Seemed quite state-controlled?
Described that way, yeah. Executive management. A state portal, the house of life. Acting like customs for foreign goods. Seen as part of an isolated economy policy. Expeditions for resources, metals, stone, incense were vital but difficult, needed for the cult and state institutions.
And women's roles. The sources suggest more equality than some other ancient places.
Relatively speaking, yes. Not very strict roles, a bit more equal than men, though men were heads of families. Main role was home and kids, but richer women had servants, social lives. Some educated women became priestesses, musicians, dancers. Daily life details are mentioned too. Houses, clothes, often barefoot, hair, jewelry, eye makeup for sun protection. Kids seen as a blessing. Early marriage, age is noted.
And the overall society structure, that famous pyramid.
The sources align with that. Pharaoh, at the top, god on earth, controlling everything, buried in pyramids. Though one source intriguingly suggests that pyramids made Pharaoh seem less godly eventually. Smallest pharaohs turning into sphinxes is mentioned.
Below the pharaoh, the elite priests, noble.
Holding power, big homes, helping run things, managing land, building their own impressive tombs, maybe spending too much, contributing to state weakness sometimes. Scribes were vital, respected, mostly men. Upper class had luxury, education.
And the majority, artisans, working class.
Hardest lives, yeah. Skilled artisans, but mostly farmers, laborers. Lives tied to the Nile flood cycle, long hours, simple homes, basic furniture, producing the food for everyone else.
Yeah.
Simple tombs, sometimes just under their houses.
Okay, bringing it all together to the present, the sources call modern Egypt a land of contradictions.
Yeah. Ancient civilization, incredible sites, but facing really complex development challenges now. The Nile, that original gift, is also called a Pandora's box, capable of causing havoc.
Threats from monsoon rains further up the Nile, problems with managing the river downstream, like siltation threatening dams.
Exactly. And the sources list this many-faceted Nile experience today. Its history and nation building, its geography as a barrier, its description as an attenuated blob, its role in complex international relations, mentioning Russia and the U.S. specifically, conflicts with other Nile Basin countries' goals.
And serious issues with water scarcity, consumption problems within Egypt, water fiascos.
Yes. Potable water poverty, unsustainable consumption, major management challenges are all highlighted as contemporary problems tied directly back to that foundational river.
Wow, it really is an incredible sweep of history we've covered. From those first farmers by the Nile, through millennia of empires, collapses, resilience, right up to today's complex reality. Hopefully, this deep dive, looking closely at the sources, has given you a solid overview, pulled out key details, and helped you feel, well, quickly informed on this vast subject.
Indeed. And despite all those cycles we talked about, ascent, decline, fragmentation, foreign influence, dramatic shifts, the sources definitely show these threads of continuity, this remarkable resilience, and enduring cultural elements that just keep reappearing throughout Egypt's long story.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you to chew on, based purely on what we've discussed from these sources. Given Egypt's incredibly well-documented history of these recurring cycles, internal struggles, waves of external influence, that fundamental reliance on the Nile, how much of what sources call the land of contradictions and the challenges Egypt faces today are really just echoes of patterns set thousands of years ago? What can this deep, deep history tell us about the enduring nature of certain challenges, and perhaps about the incredible resilience embedded within this civilization?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources on Egypt's history.